Thank you so much, Kristine, for taking time to have this conversation with me and to share your creative practice and how you've been developing that in the theatre industry. I just would like to start really from the beginnings of your process and what that process entailed and how over the years you've seen that develop and in what ways or in which avenues you've kind of focused into.
So yeah, look, in terms of my practice, as a director, as a teacher, when I was an actress for 10 years and when I stopped acting and started directing and teaching, it was very much my natural instinct to work very directly and very closely with the actors in front of me. So, I wouldn't necessarily employ a Stanislavski technique or a Meisner technique or these techniques. I would actually employ the tool of observation. So I would look at an actor and I think, gosh, how can you be better? What's blocking you? What's stopping you? So it was always me in relationship to that actor. And each and every actor, of course, is unique, is individual. They have their own vernaculars. They have their own, often first or second languages, which they may not use in the professional space. And it was very natural for me to use all those things and to bring them into the rehearsal room and not say to an actor, look, bring this part of you into the rehearsal room, leave part of you outside. Now, I didn't actually realize I was actually doing that until I began to articulate what I was doing. And I started to articulate what I was doing about 10 years into my theatre company, Tamasha. Now, Tamasha was primarily a company we were set up to address the dearth of people from Indian or Pakistani background, let's say, on the stages, stories from those backgrounds being told in contemporary theatre practice, and we set up to do that. So we worked a lot with, let's say, Asian actors early on, and I was observing very early on, just with those Asian actors in my rehearsal rooms, that it was quite unusual for them to work in other languages, other Indian languages, other vernaculars, this, that, and the other. And I worked with those languages, and we also went into schools with our education program. And again, with our education program, I was very shocked when we went into secondary schools to see that teachers in the school classroom, drama school classroom, were not using at all the cultural backgrounds of their students. And some of those students, their English was not always their first language. And I found this quite strange. Anyway, at Tamasha in 2000, we set up a wing called Tamasha Developing Artists, where we started training actors, writers, directors. And lots of actors started coming to those classes from diverse backgrounds, diasporic heritage, whatever you call them, somatically othered. They used to come to our workshops, and I would gently say, well, look, I can see you're British Vietnamese. Do you have a Vietnamese language? Can we use it? Do you want to use it? Let's see what happens when you use it. And sometimes there was resistance because they'd never used that language in the professional space. But when they were persuaded to use it, so many of them had these incredible explosions. And they suddenly released themselves and a part of themselves that they felt they could not bring to the professional space. And I saw this time and time again. It was extremely powerful. And, you know, I had lots of incredible feedback, and lots of people wrote testimonies about being able to be themselves in a rehearsal room instead of feeling they had to mimic the center or mimic the cultural authority. And a friend of mine, actually, Sita Brahmachari herself, who also was an academic and educationalist and is now a writer, she said to me, you've got to write this down. So I basically then did start writing it down, just notating it. But actually, I ended up doing an MPhil at the University of East London. And I wrote a really big thesis on it and underpinned it with a lot of theory as well, and was very warmed to see that, of course, there were other people talking about using cultural context, embracing social and cultural backgrounds in our own space, and how to play with the intra-cultural dynamics within a 21st century rehearsal room. And I guess my methodology has evolved through that time, through work on the floor, and then an academic study and continuing work on the floor, which I try to expand as I practice.
And when you're working with the actors in this intracultural approach, as you called it, there's one that is the release for the actor, because suddenly they're embodying and accepting all aspects that are them as an actor. But in terms of their in the space and the way they work with other actors and the way they play the characters, what do you notice in their being in that particular sense?
So, you know, look, I have reconsidered a lot of words in actor training, and this, you know, this can be a bit contentious as well. So, for instance, like you're sort of saying, being the character. Well, I don't really use this idea character. I use this idea of the actor having the pleasure to play something. So, in actor training, one of the big words is transformation, and I believe when I can get an actor to be free with themselves, to feel they have the right as a British Vietnamese person to play Marsha in The Seagull with everything that is inside them, then they transform, because then that artist becomes, you know, the muse comes in and they can start to do anything, and they can start to instinctively hear the text rather than think, no, I have to do the text like this, Chekhov is done like this, you know, I'm the first British Vietnamese ever to do a Chekhov, it's all normally done by people like this, so maybe I'll just alter my voice a bit and do it like that. Well, you know, you're on a hiding to nothing if you do that. So it's this thing of coming to the actor and saying, you are the actor, your name is Shane, and Shane, you will have the pleasure to play, and let's find your pleasure to play, and how do we do that? Now, obviously it's aligned with what is in the text, but I can't forget you. When you come into the rehearsal, the most important thing in front of me at that moment is you, is you. It is you. And I think in a way we do in many countries, and in a lot of sort of European traditions, we do have a hierarchy. You know, the writer sits at the top, the director, then, you know, then there's the designer, and then it goes down. And, you know, the poor actors on the floor who come in then to work on the first day in front of everyone are terrified, because they also feel, particularly if you're somatically othered, that there's a way to do this, and I don't know what that way is, and I'm not quite sure why I'm in the company. I've seen it so many times.
And I just want to draw on something that you were saying there about feeling, and this is really important to me as well as a creator, that not only does the performer feel, but actually that feeling has a cyclical process with the audience. And I just, building on that, want to hear from you, when you're directing a piece of work, there's obviously the interactions between the characters, the narrative structure, but what is the things you look for as a director in creating a piece of work or staging?
So obviously, I mean, I do a lot of work on, I understand the text first. I don't do too much work. Actually, I don't do too much work because, funnily enough, sometimes I don't really understand a text fully until I hear the actors read it. And then I think, oh, yeah, got it. That's it. Oh, yeah, no, it's not that. It's something else. So in a way, until I hear the actor's response to the text, sometimes I don't quite know what the text is fully. So I don't do too much work around the background and understanding every line. I don't do that. What I do is I do a lot of work, I think, around the mise en scène, because I love that. And I have a really strong sense, I think, of mise en scène and a strong aesthetic sense. And I really feel that, you need to have the right space for actors to move in. The furniture's got to be in the right place. And you do need to know how to get actors to really, in a really pleasing way, move around that space. So, for example, I'm just currently directing a drama school, The Seagull, with second years. And one of my actresses playing Marsha has a Guyanese and Jamaican background. Very Caribbean background. And as well as her British background. And one day I said to her, well, I mean, this was obvious. I said, look, you must have that in your voice. Yes, I do. She started working in her vernacular, her home vernacular, which was of a West Indian descent. And it just opened her out. It opened everything out. And I saw that she wiped a tear away from her eye and she said to me, I haven't done this since I actually came and auditioned here. And she just felt, oh, okay, I have the permission like this to be in this role. And it was just wonderful. So, but she's also playing the woman who's playing her mother is this wonderful, Anglo-Saxon actress who's also playing with her own Anglo-Saxonness. And I don't see there's a contradiction when I put those two together, because I hear the music of both of them. And when the two of them are so seated in themselves, they then can hear the music of the text. They bring their own music to the play, and then we can rock and roll. So I'm making the music, I'm playing with the intra-cultural dynamics. Rustam Barucha says this. I'm playing with the intra-cultural dynamics within that rehearsal room. And I don't then have to sort of think, yeah, but why is that person speaking like that? And why is that person speaking like that? Where's the standard English? Because I think this idea of standard and neutrality is never politically neutral. A standard is not it's politically not neutral to have a standard, because the neutral is always driven by someone or someone's standard.
And I'm just going to bring, in terms of language, there's obviously spoken language, and I also recognize language as something that can be physical. There are physical languages or body language.
Yes.
And dance languages. And I know you worked on The Arrival, directed The Arrival with Circus Space, and so you were working with physical bodies and a physical language. And with your sort of intra-cultural approach, it'd be great to hear how it was to work with performers with a physical language in it, and whether your approach and creative practice started to resonate on that plane too.
Yeah, well, it was a really fascinating exercise and exploration. In a way, I put myself through it. It was very hard because I really wanted to see how far the practice would extend. And, The Arrival was based on the graphic novel by Sean Tan, Any Arrival in Any Country at Any Time. And we used those beautiful graphic images and made a story, and Sita Brahmachari wrote a very sparse poetic text, and some of the stuff was drawn through improvisations. Basically, I wanted to, and circus, they were called Circus Space at that time, opened their arms and brought me in, and they were absolutely wonderful to collaborate with them because they were very open about this, and they too were sort of trying to look at this themselves. So I wanted to see whether the circus discipline of an artist, whether it was their rope or their silk or, their slack rope, whatever it was, whether that discipline was something else I could refer to and use as a cultural context. Mm-hmm. And then how could I, with that cultural context, the Chinese pole and the Greek person on that Chinese pole, how could I fuse those cultural contexts together, the Chinese pole and the Greek person on the pole? And what I found, in a weird sort of way, was a bit like what I've been talking about before in terms of, people coming in and mimicking something that they're not, is that there were, in the early days, in those rehearsals, it was very difficult for those artists, very, very diverse cast, to go onto their equipment without feeling they were simply athletes or dancers or physical performers. They could not bring anything of themselves, anything, to their equipment. And I thought, this is a fascinating thing that I'm going to prove can be done. So I just started getting them to do, improvisations on their equipment across equipments. I had an Australian Vietnamese girl. She said, "Oh, I don't really speak Vietnamese." Well, she did. And I got her to just start doing improvisations on her hoop in her Vietnamese, and then in her Australian voice, then in a Australian Vietnamese, everything. And I just, through that, I was able to get them to, because I felt if I could get them to be themselves on their equipment, we could in fact curate and shape new routines on their equipment. They wouldn't only do, movement A or trick B, or that sounds rude, I don't mean that, trick C. They would actually, through the sort of fury of acting a great scene in their own heritage, they would also sort of, the movement would become part of that. And indeed, through very careful and slow work, that is what happened. So I had this British Nigerian girl in the company, and she was the greatest example to me because she could not get on her pole, on her rope, without pointing her feet. She played this wonderful Nigerian woman. So she'd sit on the floor, like on the ship that leaves, and she'd be in conversation with a Nigerian accent, and it was just absolutely true and magnificent, bringing herself and her background to the work. And then the minute she literally got from the floor to the pole, she was a completely different. She couldn't bring her. I used to say, you have to take your Nigerianness with you to the pole. So I just worked on this tiny little moment of floor to pole, and helped her sort of pull the Nigerian woman onto the pole. And now if you see a video of it and she climbs the rope, I keep saying the pole, the rope, you can see that there's no difference now between the floor and the rope. And I've never seen something like that in circus. I'm looking at the pleasure to play that woman on that rope. I'm just not looking at a trick on a rope. So that was the exploration in that.
And just to sort of clarify that, so in that process, you could say that there was a language. She I mean, I'm taking the example you put forward. She had a language, but the language was learned and she knew how to speak this language, but she hadn't imbibed it in her own being.
Yes.
Not in a bodily sense, but in a cultural sense.
Yes, exactly.
And so by bringing together the physical language and this other cultural aspect of her that she had been, and I'm making it too, there's obviously more, um, together, in some sense, she became whole, but in terms of the physical language shifted to a wider, a wider lens, can we say?
Well, it did shift to a wider lens. And, you know, this is where Circus Spacers were marvelous, because they were so curious and they were so patient. So we had the head of acrobatics there working with us, and I'd call him in and I'd say, look, can you see what she's doing? Can you now help me just shape it? So, or is there something now in what she's doing? Can we put in that big move there, because it will fit in the center of that? And he and I worked together. So the choreography was made in collaboration. So in collaboration with her cultural context, and then in collaboration with the head of acrobatics, and in collaboration with me. And the movement sequences were made like that. And, you know, we could have lost confidence. We could have lost confidence, and we could have just thought, no, it's not quite big enough. Look, yes, fine, go back and do, you know, trick A. But we didn't. But that's where this beautiful collaboration between me, Tamasha, and Circus Space happened, because we did trust each other, and they gave me time.
I mean, I find it really fascinating, and actually it's so beautiful, because I think from definitely from a Bharatanatyam perspective, there's a way in which you deliver that particular language, and I'm kind of flipping it so that this is the Indian dance way to do it, but then being born and brought up in a different cultural context where I'm in contact with many different cultures, they all are part of me. And then actually that language, that physical language on its own, is contained to represent a particular identity. But then by embracing these other aspects, whatever they are, their thought processes, their gesticular tendencies, they seep in and it shifts this physical language. It becomes my own true language in a sense. And I kind of feel that that is a parallel to what you were.
Absolutely. No, I mean, exactly. And this is the beautiful work that you're making. Absolutely. And it comes from the pluralism within yourself. And that's why I think it's quite difficult sometimes, you know, to understand. You know, I know the journey you've been on. And when people see your work for the first time, or maybe in the early days, people look at it and they haven't seen it before. And they just think, well, I don't know what that is. I can't give it a name. It's not Bharatanatyam. It's not that. It's, you know, but, and that's why it's a long, you know, that's why people like you and me have been on such a long journey. But it's different.
Yeah, it is. I'm just looking at the time and realizing that we've come to 20 minutes, and I could talk, continue talking with you, Kristine, but we're going to have to bring this to a close. But thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences, your insights, your practice and process with me in this conversation.
Thanks, Shane.